again, I am so glad that you are here. I've got Brandy on the other side, thank God, keeping me on the straight and narrow, making sure I sit up straight. And yeah, it's been a while. We missed last week because Canada was celebrating Canada Day. We had it on Thursday, and almost everybody took a nice long weekend. And then, of course, our friends south of the border were celebrating July 4th. So we thought it was best to send it to this week. So I'm going to start off with a number of questions. I have from Cat Lover. She has asked if there's such a thing as having too many quilts, and there's no such thing as having too many quilts, but the truth is you can't take them with you, and you can only use so many on your bed. So it is advantageous to find another outlet for them. I remember when I first started, I was doing the math. Okay, I'm going to make one for everybody in my family, and then maybe I would make some for people just outside my family, but I was going to very quickly run out of people. And then I found charity quilts. My very first charity project was making quilts for Syrian refugees when they arrived. Then when I was with the Stony Creek Guild, we made them for the Hamilton Police, and it was in their, they gave quilts out to children that had been in traumatic situations. And it just took one meeting where the police officer was telling how valuable they were. You know, children were having the worst day of their life, and suddenly they had this really nice, warm article to cover them and to keep. And it was worth all the effort, just knowing that. And since then, I've come across other projects. You know, I have a close group of quilters that we make baby quilts for a local hospital for parents that are going home with basically, their level of poverty is they just don't have much. So we make quilts for them. And so yes, and then of course there's the big bold patterns that you want to make. You know, like I just finished off my 4th of July. Those aren't going anywhere. But I was watching Mary Fons had a feed, and she was talking about a quilter that I was not familiar with, but she was very popular. She was one of the first people that quilt shows and education, and she was at an age where she realized she had to sell them off, otherwise you know, her family was going to have to deal with it. She was at that age. So there comes a point where you just realize you can't have them all. So it's very good to have an outlet. I don't think there's such thing as too many, but you can't take them with you. Okay. And she also asked, what are my thoughts on vintage machines? When I look at those beautiful featherweights, I get such a serious case of FOMO, and I want to grab one immediately, but I can only sew on one machine at a time. So I have my old Bernina, which might be considered vintage now. It's over 30 years old. It is a beautiful machine. It runs so nicely. But again, I can only use one at a time. I have an industrial machine that I bought a year ago, and I've only been able to use it maybe 3 or 4 times because you can only use one at a time. So I love them, but I'm not going to buy one. Jane Gregory has asked, where can you get your vintage quilts appraised? You can get just Google it actually. Many quilt judges are also quilt appraisers. I know Barbara, I just discovered Barbara Brackman with my interview and doing all the research for her, and she's connected to so many women that are appraisers and quilt historians, and she had a YouTube live, I think it was called 6 Know-It-Alls, and there would be all of them were appraiser historians. So you don't have to look very far. You can simply Google it or just dig into a couple of the historical channels. I don't personally know anyone, but I do have friends that know people. And my cousin Leslie actually has one of the largest collections, or at least she was told she has one of the largest collections, because she inherited all her grandmother's quilts. And a couple of them are really big ribbon winners. So they're out there, easy to find. Just ask a couple of people. Susan Grimes has asked how to quilt a verse or a saying on a quilt. Am I stuck, or have I ideas above my ability? Oh, there are so many interesting ways to put sayings on quilts. I've been to QuiltCon, has had some fabulous ones. Now, I've seen them done with hand embroidery. I've seen them done with machine embroidery. I've seen them done with just free motion quilting skills. So, and then I just saw one with tiny orchard quilts. She just took the name Drew and she programmed it into her long arm, and it was just different shapes of the word Drew all over the quilt. So there's many interesting ways you can do it. And of course, you mentioned a really good point. Is it within your skill level? So you can trace out a saying. I would expect it to be in cursive if you're going to do it on your long, if you're just going to do it free motion. So I would practice a couple of times to make sure that you can do the shapes. If it's going to be a hidden message, you're going to do it in a thread color that's matching your background. And if your skills are not as great as you want them to be, that might be the way to go. It'll be a hidden message. What I have done with my machine, I have letters available to me with my my new Bernina, and I often put a saying in the binding. When I give out baby quilts, I'll embroider the name of the person with the date of the birth and maybe the weight and height of the child too. So I've also given away memory quilts, and I put in poems on the binding as well. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. Practice. The key to it is practice. Do it a couple of times. It may take you 3 to 4 months for you to get to the skill level that you think you should have. So you want to figure out what scale of the letters. Are you going to do them 2 inches high? Are you going to do them 1 inch high? You'll find your sweet spot and then design your layout from there. Okay. Lavone Merritt Mills has asked, how do you manage large fabric yardages? The 7 yards arrive in the mail and yards for borders and bindings, and suddenly you're overwhelmed. So I have, when I've bought wide backs or those yardages, I keep them totally separate from my other fabrics, because I know that I'm using them for backings or borders. I'm just using them differently. I'm not using them in my everyday quilting. So, but figure out ahead of time, just don't randomly buy 7 yards. Figure out how much you need to make a quilt. For instance, for a baby quilt that I was talking about for the hospital, my baby quilts are only 40 inches wide. I can make them taller, but I don't make them any wider than 40 inches because that's the width of yardage. And when I quilt them, I'm just cutting 1 piece of yardage for that. When you are doing larger quilts, of course, you're going to have to piece that together to make your bigger quilts. So figure out what those magic numbers are and buy that yardage in multiples of that fabric. Don't buy the extra, just buy that. And then with the pieces that you cut off all over the edge, I've done Stash Buster videos and Scrap Buster videos where I've shown how I use those. So the pieces on the bottom, the pieces on the top, I cut into 2-inch strips, and I often sew them all together so I'll have a binding ready to go for another quilt. And I trim off the batting, and I I make pillows out of those little pieces. But have a purpose prepared for those scraps. And of course, cut it so that you don't have a lot. Okay, just pre-thought. I'd like to thank Linda Patrick. Thank you very much. Did Linda have a question? Somebody has asked, what is the quilt behind me? So this is Jen Kingwell's Long Time Gone. I did this in a quilt along with Gnome Angel, who I'm currently doing the 100 Days, 100 Blocks. And it's a little bit different in that I screwed up a couple of the, I blew the size of this block, so I had to rework this section a bit. And this block is special to me. And I actually did it the year that Canada turned 150. So that was my 150 quilt. Karen Aikenhead. Now, Karen, I have seen a lot of questions from you in the past. Thank you very much. Linda, thank you very much. I appreciate your love for my tutorials. Karen has asked, she says, you have often mentioned you would never purchase more than 2 yards of fabric you stumble on, but I don't have a project in mind for. The question is, what if the fabric is potentially a background fabric for a large quilt top? Then how much would you buy? So that's a whole category in itself. But the thing is, you would calculate. You make that calculation. If you're going to use it as a background fabric, you will have an idea. Are you using it in the background of a queen? Are you using it in the background of a twin? Who is it for? You know, if it's little dinosaurs, not likely it's going to be in the background of a queen. And that's where you make your calculation from. You don't worry about, not everything's going to be for a king or queen, and those are often the exception than the rule. And don't buy it unless you know specifically. You cannot be buying 7 yards of fabric as a background for a king quilt over and over and over again and not be making those king size quilts in the thought that maybe one day you're going to make them. Those big bodacious quilts, the thought process, in my opinion, should be more methodical. You know, don't be buying fabric for the one day that you might be making it. When you decide you are going to make it, then you're on the hunt for those particular fabrics. Sharon Gilpin has asked, can you give us ideas regarding groups or charities who welcome donations of homemade quilts? Well, I've mentioned a couple of those in my opening question, but I would look to, well, many of the local guilds will know which ones are good. Quilts of Valor are always looking for quilts, but they have a specific type of quilt that they're looking for, I think. But your local hospices will look for them, your local nursing homes. There are just so many people that are deserving of quilts. So it's not going to take a lot of looking to find out. But one thing I would recommend is, for all of us, is to not commit to quantity. If somebody's looking for 25 quilts and you are one person, do not commit to more than the one at a time, because it puts way too much pressure on you and it'll distract you possibly from other types of quilts that you want to make. But be part of something is also probably a good reason to join a guild, so you can be part of their charity projects. M. Rankin asked how to use those thread stands for the larger cones. Well, I just luckily had one here at the office. This is my travel one, but they come in different sizes. So the real key for these is the thread needs tension. The thread, so the spool would go on here. There's a hole on this one that it goes up through here, and then it goes through here, and then it goes to your machine. So between this and this, that keeps the tension to your machine. Now, I have another stand at home that doesn't have this hole. It just goes directly up to this. And I often find that I have to turn it slightly away to get just a little bit more tension on it. But then, if you have been watching my Karen's Quilt Circle, you know about Bernina Jeff. I was watching his channel, and he showed how he took one of these little clips, these quilting clips, and put a little bit of double-sided tape on the back, and then he put it on the back of the machine, and he was talking about putting the thread through that first before going into your machine, and I'm doing that now, and it makes a big difference. So that's the key thing about the thread, is keeping that tension on it. And you also just want to make sure that the thread is moving freely up there. It should be okay. But sometimes the thread can get, you might be taking a thread that's not the top thread. So that's how they work, and they're good little things, and that means you can buy your thread in bulk. Lavone had another one, trimming dog ears from HSTs. So I don't have an HST, but when you fold two half square triangles together and you press them, they have a little dog ear on one side and a dog ear on the bottom. And do I have one of those here? I think I might. Sorry. I do. So this is a dog ear, this little triangle right here on the end. It's up to you. You'll find I like to trim them off when I square up my HSTs, but you may choose to do it at another time. It really does not matter when you trim them up. There is a special ruler when you're to square up your HSTs that has a little slicing thing on the side so that you trim them up ahead of time, but I like to trim them up when I square off. There are occasional times when I'll just go through with scissors and cut them off, but in general, when I square up my HSTs, that's when I trim them. What can I place under my wool pressing mat to protect the surface underneath? Well, you can put down a silicone sheet. You can buy them at the dollar store. There are silicone mats and things like that you can put underneath it, but you should not be using steam with your wool mat. And that's what's possibly damaging the surface underneath, is you using steam. The steam's going down. So use a spritz bottle and dry iron. Martina Kopel. Do you know why my husband's grandmother sewed rocks the size of a quarter in the corner of her quilt? The last quilt she made was in 1980. Well, that would be to weight it down so that the corners didn't curl up. That's my guess. Anybody else have any other guesses? Just put them in the chat. Karen A has asked, what are my favorite pins to use when piecing? I very rarely use pins. I use pins when my piecing and my quilt gets too big to handle and the weight begins to work against it. And at that point, I have two different types I use. I use a very small one called Spanish lace. And then I use the long ones with the little flat thing on them. They're very, very lightweight, but I don't use them on my seam. I use them away from my seam and parallel to my seam. And it's just really to control the weight of the quilts so that it doesn't stretch as I'm sewing it. I'm intending to do a video on pins. I just haven't got around to it yet. Susan McHenry is asking, why is my binding wavy? Well, there's a lot of variables there, Suzanne, that I don't know the answers to. So it could be that you're not doing it on grain. It could be that you're pulling it. It could be that you've ironed it. I don't know whether you're using bias binding or you're using regular binding. And there's just a lot of variables. So I've done a series on binding. So go watch those. There's 3. There's the basics, there's wide and narrow binding, and how to do machine binding. So if it's not answered in that, grab me in another Q&A, but just provide a little bit more details. Mary, I'm sorry. Mary has said that her mom passed away 4 years ago today. I had her cancer quilt, and the day she died in hospice, someone stole her quilt. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened. I think you just have to take comfort in the fact that you made a beautiful, beautiful quilt and that somewhere somebody is enjoying it. But I'm sorry about that. Nancy Cox has asked, I'd love to make a quilt for my mother's scraps and orphan blocks. She's got 6 inches and 7.5, 7.5, 9 inches, thinking about a row quilt. Is this a good design, or do you have another suggestion? I think that's an excellent idea, doing row by row and grouping them together by size, and make the rows first, and then you can just play with where they go. They don't necessarily, the biggest ones don't necessarily have to be at the bottom or the top. You can just play around with all those beautiful different blocks. I think that would be great. And then just do some sashing in the middle. For color-wise, I don't know whether she was using all common colors or whatever. If it's a really wide variety of fabrics and patterns and colors, just take a look at your color wheel and choose colors from over here, and that will help pull it all together, because these are desaturated. They don't have a lot of color in them, and that will be a softer way of pulling everything together. And it doesn't need to be on this one. It can be, you know, a desaturated red, or it can be desaturated blue, just depending on what you have. You don't have to go all the way to gray or black, but just use something a little bit less desaturated if you have a huge variety of shades and colors. Jackie Heaney has said that she's loving my 100 days, 100 blocks. If you don't know what we're talking about, it is making a block a day for 100 days. Gnome Angel has a pattern called Kinship Fusion, and there's 100 blocks in it. And she's asked, why did I choose such a dark navy as the background? I intended, after I interviewed Gnome Angel, I realized I had this huge collection of Tula pinks that I had really barely put a dent in the previous two years, and I thought this would be a great project to use it. I love fussy cutting, and I've been so enjoying. We're on day 10, and I've been having so much fun. I came up with the pattern just by pulling it from the stash. I really had a choice of either going with a blue, the blue side of it, or the pink side of it, or the orange side of it. And I was already working with a lot of orange. Just finished the 4th of July quilt. I've been working with oranges. My lemonade quilt had a lot of orange in it. So I just thought maybe I'll do something that I don't normally do. And it has that lime green, just a touch of lime green. She's done a number of different layouts for this one, depending on how many blocks you manage to finish. And there was one that she had it was fairly dark and then had a light corner in it, so there was a lot of contrast between it, and I really liked it. So I thought I would try and do the majority of it in those darker blues and purples, and then I would have my lime green just in little flecks throughout it, and then heavy in that one corner. So that's my plan. That's my plan. That's why I chose it. How much, Stacy Bell has asked, how much do I spend on your supplies for quilting per month? Well, honestly, I could not spend a dime on supplies and continue quilting for many, many months. This year, I haven't bought much fabric. What I have bought, because I bought my long arm, I've been using my budget on thread and wide backs, just so I had those in stock. But a lot of my purchases I've already had. I think I bought the cider fabric at the beginning of the year. So I would probably spend, I try not to spend any, but I think I probably at the moment spend about $100, maybe $150, maybe two. Let's be honest, maybe $200 a month, because it just comes in different avenues. Sometimes it could be a pattern, sometimes it could be a magazine. This month, what I've spent my money on is thread. I have small spools of matching Tula Pink ones to go with my Kinship Fusion quilt, my 100 Days, 100 Blocks, but I realized I'm going to be using a lot of thread through this, and I bought more thread. So I just choose, and because that, I bought it from Keystone. Do I have it here? I bought it from Keystone, and of course, I looked in their sale pile, so I bought a couple of half yards of fabrics that have bees on it. My son is a beekeeper, so I thought maybe I could do something with those. That's how your stash builds. You buy little bits and pieces here and there. That's how it gets out of control. But yeah, so. Karen, any idea of how to organize all your needles related to quilting and other crafts? You have needles all over the place. Well, my personal opinion is that you keep your needles where you use them. So if you are doll making, keep your doll making needles with your doll making supplies, and keep your quilting needles with your quilting supplies. I keep my sewing machine needles by my sewing machine, but I keep my applique and my paper piecing ones and with my embroidery threads and my paper piecing supplies. So, but the trick is to know to have a spot with those supplies where they're to be kept. So just make yourself a little kit. They can be homemade. I'm actually going to be doing some sewing as you go, sewing on the go containers in a couple of weeks, but little scraps of wool thread. A friend of mine made me a container with some, it's basically a sewing kit, and it's like a little book with leaves of wool in it, and you just separate your threads by that. So. Mary, if I go to a long armor to get my piece quilted, do you need to make the quilt sandwich? No, your long armor will do that. Your long armor will often have the batting as well, so check ahead of time. They do all sorts of extra services, or some of them do. Some of them put on binding, some of them will square up the quilt for you. So there's normally a discussion with your long armor ahead of time. There's an inboarding form that most of them have, so that you check off those different things. But don't be afraid if you're a newbie to ask questions, because there's a lot of things that you can do that your long armor will appreciate. So check with her. Teresa Venderven asked, do I use a clapper? A clapper is a piece of wood. It's called a tailor's clapper, and it's used for pressing your seams. You apply steam to a seam and you put this on top of it, and it helps set that seam nice and flat. Do I use one? Very rarely. I do not press my seams flat, for one. I press my seams to the side. I use them when I'm having a tricky seam that just won't lie flat. I use them towards the end of a project more often than before. And I find just using a dry iron with a spritz bottle and press, not iron, gives me great results. So I don't need to do that extra step. And part of it is also that laying that clapper down, you need to wait 30 seconds for that clapper to work. And that's that slows me down. So I'm often not really interested in slowing down. So I do have one, and they are great items to use. I use them a lot more when I'm making clothes because they make seams really lie flat. How many projects do I keep open at once? Do you limit how many projects you have in progress? So I was just looking last night. I have 10 projects that I add blocks to when I have the blocks. So a lot of them are, 4 of them are very scrappy. One of them is just making 10-inch squares. So when I have a scrap of fabric and I can make a 10-inch square, I'm basically making my own layer cakes. And from those, I'm making clamshell pieces. And when I have enough, I will make a whole quilt. But I have I think I probably have 5 scrappy blocks that I'm making all the time and just adding to them. But I try to have one big project on the go. So that was my 4th of July. And then I have lighter lifts, ones that I just do 30 minutes at a time in the morning. So right now, the 100 Days, 100 Blocks is filling that 30-minute one. And with the 4th of July gone, I'm going to have to go into my stash. I've got to figure out whether I'm going to start a whole new project or I'm going to go into one of the kits that I have. But to say that I only have 2 going at one time would be incorrect as well. But I try to only have 2 out at one time. I try to keep them tucked away and try to limit the chaos in my sewing space. I have an English paper piecing project that I need to bring back on to my front burner. It was supposed to be a 5-year project, and this is year 5. I got 6 months. I should be able to do it by the end of the year if I can get my act together. So I try to have one big one and one fast and easy one going at one time. So depending on my mood, what I feel like doing, I've got choices. Yeah. Okay, I see we're at the 35-minute mark. I'm just going to answer a couple more questions. I've got a couple more things. Anitra Collins says she's in Australia and she's just bought a long arm and she wants to know how long did it take before I became confident in the stitching. So before I had my own long arm, I used long arms, and I had a rental unit that I was able to access downtown Toronto, and I had a friend that had one, but I learned on the rental one downtown Toronto. And honestly, I think my first 10 quilts, all they were loop-de-loops and or a meander pattern. And I realized when I got my own long arm, I really didn't know much about tension, but I was fairly confident with those. I can remember the owner one time saying, "Karen, you're going too fast," and just beginning to feel about pacing and working it through. There was a couple of projects where I did a step too far and had to pull it off, rip out all the stitches. I think within about 3 or 4 quilts, I was pretty confident with the loop-de-loop and the meander. I did not have any worry about those whatsoever. Then there's, of course, the ones where you just go straight, do straight line quilting. Those are pretty brain numbing because they're so repetitious, and there's challenge in it, but it's not a very invigorating type of method. I'm just getting confident in the other types. I've been following Tracy at Whirls and Swirls. If you haven't seen her channel, go check that out. And I've just been practicing some of her free motion quilting techniques. So with my lemonade one, I chose one that was like a thistle, and I did another one where it was more of a tulip. and just getting used to laying out the density, because I don't really like tight quilting. I like my quilts to be soft. I don't want them firm. So I'm still getting, it's a journey. You've just got to be patient with yourself and realize, you know, you're at the beginner and you're just going to build your skill upon skill, and don't be afraid to practice. You know, I threw on a couple of pieces on my long arm that I did nothing but fool around with them. And now that they're done, I put a binding around the outside of it, and it's my dog blanket for the car. So, you know, if you have any friends that that need that, or the moving blankets, there's always a way you can use them up. And don't use your good stuff. Just use the old fabric that you've fallen out of love with to do those with. So practice is key. Back to this thing. Stephanie Ray has said, my cone thread holder falls over and gets in the way. I don't understand how to use it. Where do I put it in relation to the machine? Help. So you might try putting a couple more pads on the bottom just to give it a little bit of weight. I put it behind, so this is going behind my machine, and I find it has to go right on the right. So it's really as right as it can be beside my machine. But follow that, putting that little clip behind your machine, because I think you'll find that it will help with the tension, the pulling on it. I don't know how many of these there are out there that it could be falling over, but they are awkward. You've got to keep it in a spot where, you know, your quilt is not ramming into it, or you're not bumping into it as you go by. But put some double-sided tape on the bottom of it if it's moving around. We are at the 40-minute mark, so I just have 2 announcements. C Rise has told me her oldest son passed on July 1st, and sewing has always given me a place to rest my thoughts. I am so sorry for your loss, C. That is just so sad. My thoughts are with you. I have 2 announcements. One, I'm going to be doing a live Q&A with Gnome Angel on July 20th. This is for people who didn't start at the beginning and might be wanting to start on, to jump on. And it's for people that may not want to commit to all 100 blocks. So she's going to show us some of her ideas for what you can do there. And she's a hoot. We have a lot of fun together. So I've really enjoyed meeting Angie, who's been one of the highlights of this year. And I am going on an Alaskan cruise next year in May. I'm going to have more details coming up in the month. But if you're like me and would like to start seeing the world again, and don't want to go too far from home, stay tuned for that. There'll be an announcement on my website, and in not next video, but the video after that. So we're just getting the final details together, and I'll let you know. And that's pretty well it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up from all over. It's been wonderful to see you all. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Take care.